Hey everybody, Matt Barton here with this week's Broker Minute or Two. Hope you enjoyed your Juneteenth week. Hey, in talking with our accounting department and our office managers, there's apparently a need for a brief discussion on some facets of earnest money. And so wanted to go through a couple things and bring up my screen up. This is our real estate purchase contract. I'm not going to go through everything exhaustively on earnest money, but suffice it to say, in this first block, this first section, we define not only how much earnest money is there, but also we create proper terms in the contract when they put it in quotes, and then later on it's referred to with a capital S. That means it's a term that was already defined up above. Same thing with buyer. And this is going to be important for kind of the conclusion of this message. So we all know the purpose of earnest money and the protocol of getting it in within 4 days of the signing of the contract, getting it to the company, and then the company has 4 days from when we receive it to then get it into our trust account. That's all good stuff. But as I scroll through this document, just look at how many times I have highlighted, and it's not exhaustive, but how many times earnest money comes into play. Not so much on the first couple of pages, but then we get into the conditions and earnest money. As an example, it talks about if the buyer wants to cancel, earnest money deposit shall be released to the capital B buyer, which goes back up to the top. Who did we define as the buyer? So if it's Bob the buyer, then that means they're the ones that this is affecting. Okay. So we go through all these references, but the important part I want to get to here is twofold. One, I'm going to talk about when somebody defaults and releasing earnest money and what's required. And some things you may not have thought about. And secondly, what is our protocol if a buyer cancels appropriately on a contract and wants to use earnest money that's in our trust account for a new transaction? So let's hit the first one. Section 16 is the default section, right? And there's any number of reasons why a buyer could default or a seller default, or they could just electively choose to for no reason. And they're entitled to do that. But it doesn't mean that they're free from the consequences in the contract. And that's primarily what Section 16 is dealing with. And so in both scenarios, buyer and seller, there's three options for the party who didn't default. And the first one, which we're all familiar with, and I hear it all the time, not all the time, but frequently, that, the buyer defaulted and they're just going to give the earnest money to the seller. Like, well, did the seller agree to that? Because as you can see here in Section 16.1, the seller elects what remedy is available. It's not the buyer's choice. And of the three remedies, you can, the buyer could, if the buyer defaulted, then the seller could cancel the contract and retain the earnest money deposit, the buyer's earnest money deposit, as liquidated damages. That's the easiest one. That's a slam dunk compared to the other two. The second one is kind of interesting. You have, and this is a part that people don't pay attention to. If you're going to go with option B, the seller needs to not receive the earnest money. It must stay in the trust account and then sue the buyer to specifically perform as per the EREPC. So the item B is an important one to pay attention to. If your client wants to sue for performance, better keep the earnest money in the trust account. Don't accept it because it robs you essentially of option B. And then the C one is, you can release the earnest money to the buyer, and then the suer could sell the buyer for additional remedies available at law, whatever the damages are. If the seller would default, the remedies are largely the same. They could agree to pay an equal amount of the earnest money if they're going to sue. They need to keep the earnest money in the trust account. In other words, don't make a claim for earnest money and they then say you're going to sue for performance, if that makes sense. Okay, so hopefully that's clear, and that's what our office managers are trained to govern by, right? The corresponding documents, anytime somebody cancels a text, a phone call, those don't work, right? We have to have, there is a buyer's notice of cancellation from UAR. There is a seller's notice of cancellation from UAR drafted by attorneys. It jumps all the hurdles. Texts, emails, phone calls don't work. Why? Well, let's jump down to Section 18. A cancellation is considered a notice under the terms of the contract, and it's very specific how notices must take place. So item A, it must be in writing. So that kind of wipes out text, phone calls, and emails. B, it must be signed by the buyer or seller who's giving the notice. Another reason why texts, emails, phone calls don't work, or conversations. And then C, this is the one that, because it's not the same as when we accept an offer, it's the additional requirement of, oh, and we must deliver it, or the other side must receive it, either the buyer or the sellers themselves, or their respective agent, or their broker or brokerage. So you have three options. It's kind of why what we fill out on Section 5 of who's representing whom is also important, because Section 18 will utilize that information to give notice. Okay, so that all makes sense. Now, the last scenario I want to cover is what happens when you have a buyer and they go under contract, they cancel appropriately. There is a buyer's notice of cancellation. And then you want to use that earnest money that's in our trust account for a second transaction. We will facilitate that, but there are some guardrails on that. One, we have to have a copy of an executed buyer's notice of cancellation, or whoever's doing the cancellation. Second part is we have to have proof of its delivery. That's this Section C of notices. So just because you upload a buyer's notice of cancellation, we as a company have no proof that it was actually given to the other side. We can't release earnest money, which is a remedy to the contract, until all of the boxes are checked, so to speak. So if you want to do this, make sure not only do you have the buyer's notice of cancellation, but you also have uploaded, for instance, the email that you sent to the other agent and or their broker. Anytime you do a cancellation, my recommendation is send it to the agent and their broker, and upload that email into the transaction. The third component, which isn't covered here, but it is a company policy, is we then need an email from your client saying they're okay taking the earnest money, say of $5,000 from transaction 1, specify the address, and utilizing it on transaction number 2 in the amount of $5,000 for address such and such. When you have all those things, we're happy to facilitate that. As a final side note, if that's going to take more than a week, we cannot keep the funds in our trust account. The division is very clear that you can't have funds in your trust account that are not affiliated with a transaction. So even though, well, they're going to be under contract in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that's great. Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut a check back and they'll have to write a new check. If it's within that 1 week reasonable period of time that the division gives us, we will facilitate that. So I hope this clarifies some of the issues surrounding earnest money, not just its purposes, but defaults, the documentations that's required, and how we transfer it from one deal to another if the situation arises that you need to do that. As always, if you have specific questions that you feel weren't covered by this broker minute or two, I'm happy to take a personal call for you. All right, have a great week, and we'll talk soon.